Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
More than 7 million Americans have Alzheimer's, according to the Alzheimer's Association. And in Connecticut, that's about 80,000 people. Scientists are so close to making meaningful strides in slowing the progression of the disease. And that makes it all the more important to talk about funding for research and how we can support patients. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today, we're talking about innovations in the treatment and care of people living with Alzheimer's disease. Later in the show, we hear from early-stage patients and their caregivers about an art therapy program at the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury. It's making a difference in their lives. We'll also hear about a new law mandating coverage for testing for those at risk of Alzheimer's. But up first, John Hamilton. He's correspondent for NPR's Science Desk. John talks about what Alzheimer's is, the treatments currently available to patients, and why cutbacks to medical research funding are especially devastating to those living with Alzheimer's now and those who will be in the future. John, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Pleasure to be here.
You have such a recognizable voice to our listeners. Many of them are very familiar with the work that you've been doing with NPR over the years. Some of our listeners, however, may not know that you have a personal connection to our conversation today, which is about Alzheimer's. Share with us why this subject of Alzheimer's disease, why it's one that resonates with you.
Well, I had been covering Alzheimer's for a few years before it showed up in my own family. And this a few years back, I found out that my aunt was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. It took a long time for people in the family to recognize it because her sort of demeanor didn't change. But then after talking with her for a while, you'd realize that she didn't remember what you'd said, 5 minutes earlier. She had to go to a memory care center. She was no longer able to care for herself. And she did die with Alzheimer's a couple of years ago.
I'm nodding along as I'm listening to you share your own journey because there's so many families like yours, like my own, who have loved ones who are dealing with this disease. So many of us say, oh, I forgot that, or I can't remember what I did yesterday. And this is so different from that sort of common inability to remember things because it has an effect on that amazing and delicate thing known as the brain. Give us a really base level understanding of when we talk about Alzheimer's disease. What are we referencing in that regard?
So Alzheimer's is the most common form of what is known as dementia. Dementia is the actual description of losing memory and thinking ability. And as you pointed out, it's very different than, as we get older, all of us, me included, sometimes it takes us a little longer to conjure up a name, or we might forget things. Our attention sometimes is not as good. Those are not signs of Alzheimer's or dementia on their own. The definition of Alzheimer's now is that you have a dementia, which means that you have this measurable problem with thinking and memory. And it's not, it's the, I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. It's, I can't remember what you said to me a few minutes ago. But the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's is that in Alzheimer's, you also have to have the presence of these amyloid plaques in the brain. And it's the combination of the cognitive problems and then confirming that the person has these plaques in their brain. That's what Alzheimer's is. Dementia can be caused by other things. You can have little strokes. You can have some sort of concussions, things like that. There are other things that can also cause memory and thinking problems that are not Alzheimer's, and those are the other dementias.
Earlier this year, there was an introduction of 2 drugs available to Alzheimer's patients. Talk to us about those 2 drugs and what it means in the scope of the kind of work that you've been doing around access for patients and also impact. What are those 2 drugs?
So these 2 drugs, one is called Leqembi, the other is called Kisunla, and they are both for people in the early stages of Alzheimer's. They do not do anything for people who are in the advanced stages, sadly. They both are quite good at removing those amyloid plaques from your brain. They do brain scans, and you can look at somebody after a few months of taking these drugs, and the plaques are dramatically reduced, if not gone. However, that doesn't translate into a dramatic effect on the progress of the disease. Both of these drugs are capable of modestly slowing down the progress. So, sort of as an example, if you took these drugs for 18 months, instead of being where a person normally would be at 18 months after getting a diagnosis, you'd be where they are at a year, right? So it slows it down by about a third, but it doesn't stop the disease. It doesn't cure it. Neither one of these drugs do. Oh, and I should also mention, these drugs are expensive. You know, we're talking $25,000, $30,000 a year. Now, Medicare is covering these drugs. So for the vast majority of people who have Alzheimer's, they probably will be able to get the drugs covered. But it is hardly the solution that we would all like to see, right?
One of the things that I love about your reporting is that you are able to help us see how everyday people, real people, their families are experiencing this. In your reporting, you profile two people who are at the earlier stages of the disease, and you discuss their treatment with these new drugs. Tell us about these two patients that you cover, Sue Bell and Myra Solano Garcia.
So both of these women had been in the clinical trials of the drug. Sue Bell, when I first met her, was still able to carry on a conversation. She went on the drug Leqembi. Her husband, even at the time, was always present during interviews and clearly had to help her through her day, you know. And he says he's not sure whether the drug helped or not. Sadly, this is especially with a drug this has modest effects, right? You can't really tell. But they reached a point where she was clearly progressing, and so they decided to stop taking Leqembi, which I think most doctors agree was the right decision because she was no longer at a stage in Alzheimer's where it was likely to do her any good. So that was one experience. The other experience is a little bit more upbeat. Myra Solano Garcia, who lives in Upland, California, she's, I think, in her mid-60s now. So she was beginning to see symptoms young. She was very informed and very aggressive about seeking care and managed to get herself into the trial of the other drug, Kisunla. And she's had a really good experience. The way she described it to me was, I feel like I have plateaued. She says, I still take care of the house. She sings at a local memory care center. She's still able to engage in these activities, and she thinks that this drug is what is allowing her to maintain it. She does have some memory loss, but she says it doesn't seem to be getting worse.
When you're thinking about these stories that you're exploring and reporting and the very different experiences of those two women, what has that taught you about the importance of those social connection for people as they are navigating this disease, as they're navigating treatment? What does the reporting show you in that regard?
The reporting shows me that people who are in close families, who have lots of social contacts, there's just no question they are more likely to get diagnosed and they're more likely to get treated. Every year, the Alzheimer's Association comes out with their estimate of the number of people in the country that have Alzheimer's. And I think the last year it's just over 7 million. But that's a guess in large part because how are you going to know if somebody is living alone and doesn't get to the doctor? And in fact, when I speak with physicians about this, they say, I have no idea how many of not only my patients, but the people who don't get to doctors very often. You know, if you only go to the doctor when you've got, I don't know, a kidney ailment or a headache or something, chances are, even if you have early stage dementia, you're not going to get diagnosed.
I want to go back to one thing. You mentioned the amyloid plaques. In this reporting, in the research, the writing, there's another phrase that I think we want to be sure our listeners know, and that is tau tangles. I may be mispronouncing that.
Tau, I think, is how they usually say
okay.
it. Yeah.
You know, I'm a little rusty on my Greek there. Define for us what tau tangles are, because that phrase does come up so often in the research and the understanding. What is that, John?
The two considered hallmarks of Alzheimer's. Hallmarks in the sense that If you dissect the brain of a person who died with Alzheimer's, here's what you're going to see. You're going to see these amyloid plaques, these sticky plaques that build up, and they build up between the neurons, between brain cells. But you also see what they call tangles, tau tangles. That tau is another type of misfolded protein. It builds up inside the cells, and it has this little fibrous, tangly appearance to it when you look at it under a microscope. So that is sort of the other part. And it's some combination of these two that seems to start this cascade that does a whole bunch of the things to the brain that ultimately result in neurons dying and us losing our memory of our loved ones and things like that.
I want to talk now about this new drug that you reported on, which is actually a nasal spray. So some innovation there happening in terms of the delivery methods of this. Talk to us about this spray and, what people are seeing in terms of this new mode of delivery.
So this spray represents one of these efforts to try to approach Alzheimer's in a totally different way, which is a great thing because it clearly, if it were just about amyloid plaques, we would have fixed it already, right? So people are looking at a variety of other things. And one of the things they know about what happens, you get plaques, you get the tangles, and then you get inflammation in the brain. And inflammation can be really damaging to cells, including neurons. And so there are a number of groups that have been trying to look for ways to tamp down this inflammation in the brain, thinking that's part of the problem, right? It's what may be adding to the death of these cells. And so I was speaking with some folks up at Mass General Hospital in Boston, and they said, we've been trying this drug that we actually developed for another disease, multiple sclerosis. That may seem like really different things, but multiple sclerosis is often considered an autoinflammatory disease or autoimmune disease. It's your own immune system that starts attacking cells. In this case, it's the cells that sort of form the insulation around nerve fibers. And as it attacks them and destroys them, you begin to have thinking problems and walking problems and all this other stuff, right? So they're thinking, that's an inflammatory disease. We think Alzheimer's has an inflammatory component too. So maybe we should try this drug. It's a nasal spray, and it doesn't actually get into the brain itself, but what it does is it triggers this sort of communication among immune cells where the cells go talk to the cells that are in the brain. And the brain, of course, has a sort of different immune system than the rest of the body, so it's tricky to address inflammation in the brain. But they found this drug that you inhale it, it talks to the brain cells in the brain that cause inflammation, and it dials them back. And they have tried it on exactly one patient so far, and I was lucky enough to meet him. He's a lovely guy named Joe Walsh. He's in moderate stage dementia right now. He has a lot of memory problems, and his sentences don't always make sense. What's encouraging is that it's hard to tell whether the progress of his loss of memory and thinking has stopped. But what is clear is the brain scans show the inflammation in his brain has been dramatically reduced. And so this is sort of the proof of concept. So now they're going to go do a study of people in earlier stages of Alzheimer's disease and see if giving this nasal spray, reducing the inflammation, can actually slow down or stop the effects of losing memory and thinking.
Given this research, John, how important is that earlier stage detection in terms of maybe giving people more options, but also greater understanding of the scope of the challenges they may encounter? How important is that? And what are you seeing around that kind of innovation?
There are two sort of parts of that. One is that if you're going to get treated, the earlier the better. And in fact, studies that are going on now that are most interesting to the scientists are studies of treating people way before they ever have symptoms. You can actually detect these amyloid plaques and the early changes of Alzheimer's decades before people develop problems with memory and thinking. If you could get treated way before symptoms appear, maybe you could actually prevent the disease entirely. So that's one reason that early detection is a big deal. The other thing is, it turns out people want to know this stuff. And it's interesting because in the past, doctors often, they kind of knew their patient had Alzheimer's, but they didn't tell them because the thinking was, well, they can't do anything about it. and it's just going to make them unhappy or their families worry about them. So that is changing. That is changing. And along with that, Alzheimer's is now part of the discussion. People talk about cancer, they talk about Alzheimer's, they talk about things that used to be a little bit taboo, a little bit of, and that's not true anymore. And there have been surveys recently done by the Alzheimer's Association and other places that show that people, they want to know their status. And the reasons they cite are, well, I need to plan my life. I have a family. If I'm going to be losing my memory or my ability to think, I need to alert them. I need to prepare for that. I need them to prepare for that. I need to make sure that my financial situation is solid and that I might be prey to somebody who calls me up and tries to get my bank account, and maybe I need to be protected. So all those reasons are where I think there's been a real change in people actively wanting to know whether they have, if not Alzheimer's, you have what leads to it is mild cognitive impairment, and there are even lesser memory deficits before that. But people want to know where they are on that spectrum.
And I also think, John, people deserve to know if they want to, so that they can make informed choices, have an understanding of where they are, and, as you said, to guard against the many ways that people are taking advantage of those who find themselves battling this disease. I want to bring us to this current moment that we are in, where there's a lot of mistrust around science. There's a lot of questioning of the integrity of science and research, even though we know through your reporting and others how critical and valuable it has been for those in the medical community, for families, for caregivers and patients to have access to that information as well. We're in that moment of questioning of science and also a clawing back of support for critical research, whether it's being done in university medical centers or being done in other settings. Given that moment and that context, what is the thing that concerns you as someone who has studied science, brain health for so long? What's the thing that keeps John Hamilton up at night?
I think the thing that keeps me up at night is the fear that decades of progress in getting to where we are now, where it seems like we're on the cusp of really figuring out this disease and being able to do something about it, that the funding and the systems and the labs that got us to this point are going to lose the support they had. Yes, there are big drug companies who will spend huge amounts of money on clinical trials, but that is the absolute last stage in the drug development process. All of these drugs that we've talked about have their beginnings in basic research that was funded in large part by federal sources, predominantly the National Institutes of Health. And right now, the National Institutes of Health is seeing major cuts to its budget. And what I hear from scientists is that their grants are going away or being delayed or being put on hold. Science can't just resume. It's not just like you can stop it now and pick up again next week if you decide to restore funding. You have mouse colonies that get lost that would take years to get back. You have research things that are in process. You have postdocs who will leave the lab and all their knowledge leaves with them. And so what keeps me up at night is that we're going to be so close to really making a breakthrough in treating Alzheimer's, and that it won't happen because the things that got us here have been abandoned.
I hear the concern, but I also hear a glimmer of hopefulness, of the possibility of this is research that is really on the cusp of a major breakthrough. And Alzheimer's is a disease, John, as you know, that affects everyone, that you're not immune to it because of your socioeconomic status, even if you may have differential access. But it is something that is touching literally almost every family in this country. Is there an element of this that gives you some hope and optimism about if we can stay the course, we may be able to see these important innovations? What's the element of hope for you as a reporter?
The element of hope is the number of people who care and who are exercising their power to, steer this course. And by that I mean, when the NIH greatly increased its funding for Alzheimer's, for example, that wasn't just their idea. Congress told them to do that. The people who are in charge of spending said, we want you to spend more on this disease because it's a huge priority for us. And you see local officials who they may be in favor of a lot of cuts, but when it comes to Alzheimer's research, they're, wait a minute. Just recently, I did a story about there was a huge grant given to folks at UC Davis, and it was for a dementia study that's closely related because you need to be able to understand, you need to be able to rule out the other dementias if you're going to treat Alzheimer's. And so they were tracking dementias, and they'd been asked to look at populations at greatest risk for developing dementia. And if you look at statistics in this country, if you put down Hispanic or Black on surveys, on government forms, you are more likely to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So they did what any scientist would do, is to say, we need to look at these populations. And apparently, because they did that, some search of funding coughed up their study, which was a $53 million study, and they were told that it was terminated. No more. And what was encouraging to me was they went and enlisted support from science community, the Alzheimer's Association. They talked to elected officials, and they made the argument. They said, Congress told us to do this. They told us to study populations at risk. They told us to study Alzheimer's, and we are doing what we were asked to do. And they won. They got the money back. So there are some glimmers of hope out there, and I cling to those.
I think we all need to cling to those glimmers in these moments to not just remember what's possible, but to be encouraged about the future and what is being done. John Hamilton is correspondent for NPR's Science Desk. Thank you, John.
My pleasure.
When we return, you'll meet Alzheimer's patients and their caregivers participating in a local art therapy program. And Sujata Srinivasan, Connecticut Public senior health reporter, describes what science can tell us about the benefits of art therapy. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Innovations in medical treatments for people living with Alzheimer's are one way to address the impact of the disease, but lifestyle therapies can also help. There's an artistic partnership between the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury and the Connecticut chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. My colleague Sujata Srinivasan is Connecticut Public's senior health reporter. She spent an afternoon at the museum talking with participants about the difference that art therapy can make in their lives. Sujata, welcome to Disrupted.
Pleasure to be here, Kalila.
We've been talking about Alzheimer's, not just from the medical clinical perspective, but the ways that it is experienced by those who have the diagnosis, as well as their caregivers, and the kind of community that they're trying to build as they navigate the uncertainties of this disease. You and members of the team were able to go to the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury. They host an art therapy program there called Memories at the Mat. Share with our listeners a little bit about that art program.
It's lovely and one of many across the country. The participants, the caregivers, and early stage dementia patients gather every month. They view the art. A docent takes them around. They look at pieces, Georgia O'Keeffe, Matisse, and inspired by that style, they come back, and if they feel like and are inspired, they sit together and they make art.
You were able to talk to two local men who are in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's and their caregivers.
David Gilbert. I'm a participant, and I've been enjoying this very much. This is our third or fourth time, maybe. It's been a blast here. I get out of it things that I would never have known existed, especially within the art or even outside the art.
I'm Nan Green. I'm Dave's younger sister. I'm not an artist. My brother is an artist and photographer. He's a hoot. We have so much fun together, everything we do. I had scooped him out of his friendship circle at the Glastonbury Senior Center, where a lot of folks with dementia are doing some activities at a table, and I come in and he's like, yeah, let's go. And here we are, another day in Waterbury, having a good time. So,
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael Quirk, and I'm an artist, and I'm a visitor to Mattituck Museum. Great space. Anything better than that? I don't know.
I'm Patty Quirk, I'm Mike's wife, and I've enjoyed being a part of this whole program. It's helped both of us. At first I was like, he's the artist. I'll just watch. But I enjoy it. I think it's fun. There's a lot of laughter too, sometimes in the art room, so it helps. He's very serious about his artwork, and I'm very like, wow, I can do this. I feel good. I get to feel the way he feels when he finishes some kind of an art project,
One thing that was so clearly visible, Kalila, was the fact that caregivers were able to take a pause, a breath from all the worrying that comes with caregiving, and especially with a disease, a progressive neurological disease like Alzheimer's. As a lot of us know, fear stems mostly from lack of control. And with this particular disease, control goes out the window as the disease progresses. But here, in this moment, in that space, there were people gathered, making art, interacting with each other, discovering themselves, and discovering long-established relationships. Couples married for decades, a brother and sister just bantering and laughing together. And it's a dynamic that was just beautiful to see.
What does the research say about the value of art therapy in these kinds of programs, or the impact that it can have on those who are living with the disease and those who are caring for those living with Alzheimer's?
Much of the research, Kalila, centering the impact of art, whether it's storytelling, whether it's poetry, visual arts, it centers around addressing the neuropsychiatric symptoms of Alzheimer's. So as we know, Alzheimer's, doctors say, is associated with mood swings, with depression, apathy, withdrawal, with sudden bursts of anger, people living rich inner emotional lives, but unable to express that or unable to communicate. And there's quite a few research, not just in the United States, but plenty of research coming from Europe, from Japan, that shows art intervention, art therapy addresses those symptoms. So while making art, the patients of early stage dementia do experience a sense of calm, a sense of belonging. One of the pioneering programs in the United States was Meet Me at the MoMA. That research was conducted by NYU, and they found that participants showed less apathy. When people get together to make art in a surrounding that is nurturing and that is welcoming to them, and the caregiver, once a week, once a month, data shows that it does significantly impact mood disorders associated with the disease.
I think what you just shared with us is another example of why art is so important. There are real therapeutic health benefits, a sense of connection that I think art has the power to do in ways that we shouldn't overlook and that we can't overstate. What I think is so key about this program as well is you don't have to be an artist to participate in it, right? It's not just for people who have artistic talent, but there is one participant in the program. His name is Dave Gilbert. He is 74, is still an artist after having studied art in college. Dave is accompanied by his sister, Nan Green, who created this beautiful book that's a collection, really, of Dave's photographs and the collages, and it's designed to remind Dave of his life, of his journey, his work, and his abilities before Alzheimer's.
When you're making art, And when the two of you are having fun and talking and sharing stories, something forgotten, does art help you remember something from the past? Does it bring back memories when you make art?
Yes, I would say that it does. And even on a small scale like that, it can come out with more meaning.
I feel like by incorporating some of these things in here, like for example, when he looks at this, he'll remember that vacation in Vermont. So he'll see a picture of a seagull, a close-up of a seagull, and he'll remember the time in Norway where he saw a seagull standing on a bridge and, took a picture. So I think the art and the photography triggers memories in that way.
Sujata, tell us when you hear about this experience and what this collage means. What does it mean for you when you hear about that?
Deeply moving and incredibly powerful. One day, when Dave no longer remembers any of this, when he opens it, at least, he might look at it through the eyes of a stranger, but he'll see something beautiful, that this is a rich life.
What I so value in this program, it is a recognition of their dignity and of their humanity. And when people are confronting a disease like Alzheimer's, like dementia, all of its forms and manifestations, sometimes people get treated as only their illness.
We don't define people by their illness because their lives are so much more. The illness might be a very big part of it, but there's another bigger part of it that is drawing on their strength. And that's what the caregivers are doing. Taking control, seizing control, finding ways and searching for means to experience a moment of joy. And that's all we can do, whether we are hit with some disease or not. All we can do is to meet the moment as best as we can. And that's what they were doing, Patty and Mike and Nan and Dave.
One of the things that was asked of the participants in this program is very simply, what is it that you want people to know about who you are as people first? We'll hear from Mike and Patty, and then we'll hear from Dave and Nan.
I'm just a regular guy. Well, I've always done artwork, I think going way back to when I was a teenager, just sort of fiddling around, and it seemed like I had some sort of talent, so I kind of kept going with it. It's something that, keeps me, my mind active and keeps me sort of busy and having something to go to, like if I'm working on a painting and I know I can't do anything with it, I'll go back in a couple days or a week or something, and it's still there. And yeah, it's always been like that to have that. And Patty's real supportive, although she sometimes doesn't understand what the heck I'm doing, right?
About me, a dedicated mother, someone who doesn't give up, maybe tackles something and won't let it go. That's good and bad. Just trying our best to get up every day and just do the best we can.
I like fun, I like art, and do a lot of different things and try to experiment with other things. It's just life.
I think it's important for people that have someone with dementia or Alzheimer's in their immediate family to keep treating that person with respect and keep their integrity, their dignity, and kind of their identity as the person. Keep treating them like you always treated them. You need a lot of patience. Sometimes the person they have always been is still right there, just right there. Yeah.
Sujata Srinivasan is senior health reporter for Connecticut Public. Her series of stories on caregivers is linked to our show page. Thank you so much for joining us, Sujata.
Thank you for having me, Kalila.
We'll also link to the Mattituck Museum and the Alzheimer's Association's Connecticut chapter so you can find more information about this and other programs for people living with Alzheimer's and their caregivers. You can go to ctpublic.org/disrupted. And just a note for our listeners, the Mattituck Museum and the Connecticut chapter of the Alzheimer's Association are sponsors of Connecticut Public. Coming up after the break, a new law in Connecticut requires insurance companies to pay for biomarker testing for Alzheimer's disease. You're listening to Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're exploring innovations in the care and treatment of Alzheimer's disease. My next guest is Christy Koval, Director of Public Policy for the Alzheimer's Association Connecticut chapter. Christy's advocacy was instrumental in getting a life-changing bill for the early detection of Alzheimer's passed in Connecticut's 2025 legislative session. Christy, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, one of the things that I think is so critical when we talk about Alzheimer's is understanding that it's not just about the medical pieces of it. There is advocacy that goes into it for those who are navigating Alzheimer's, for their families, their caregivers, and really raising our broader public understanding of what's at stake and what can be done. Talk to us about your role at the Alzheimer's Association and how you navigate those pieces.
Well, thank you so much. So in my role as Director of Public Policy, I work with families all across the state, with care providers, with caregivers, with those living with the disease, and I really try to demystify the process of sharing your story with policymakers, both here at a state level and with our members of Congress, sharing their story to impact policy change. So we really realize true change around things like increased funding for NIH research funding, more dementia training, more funding for respite care, things like that. And I try to make people comfortable with that process.
It's a big job. And it's also a big responsibility, right? Especially in this context where there can be so many competing needs and interests. But I also think, Christy, sometimes people forget that, yes, Connecticut is a smaller state, but Connecticut is really leading the way on some of these issues to think about how do we address the needs of people in our state, but be part of a broader national conversation as well about what can be done. Set the landscape for us a little about what it looks like here in Connecticut in terms of the number of people that you're working with or on behalf of, and how it is so important for this state to take a lead.
So the Alzheimer's Association knows that there's about 80,000 people in Connecticut who are living with Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. And, you know, the numbers are just going to keep rising because Connecticut is an older state and age remains the biggest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's. So I think what's important and also works in our favor is that we're a small enough state so that we can work across party lines and really develop relationships with all legislators. You know, legislators have been very invested in this cause. People want to be part of a solution, even in challenging times like this. So we really do realize bipartisan support for a number of our issues, even if a particular piece of legislation doesn't pass in 1 year for one reason or another. As we know, there's a lot of competing priorities. We usually always receive a number of different pieces of support for our legislative initiatives.
When you think about the work that you're doing with families and caregivers, what are you hearing about some of the challenges that they face in trying to support the people that they care about, but also support themselves?
It's a very complex issue. So there's first the issue of getting that diagnosis. And once someone is diagnosed, it's access to services. And so it's looking at what does the actual support system look like for that individual, either the informal caregiver supports and or formal. And also the cost. Alzheimer's disease is very costly. And because, you know, the path is very unique in terms of what someone is experiencing, people can live on average from 4 to 20 years with the disease diagnosis. And so people may need in-home care. They may utilize adult day center. At some point, they may need 24-hour care. They may need skilled care in a facility if that's required. But a lot of times these families are really doing this on their own with some supports.
Mm-hmm. You know, this is a very personal concern for me and for my family, as we are at the heart of figuring out, how do you care for a loved one who is navigating this disease with all of the uncertainty that people face? When you hear about the frustrations that families are facing, not knowing how to navigate the sort of complex maze of systems and structures, how does that shape the work that you do with the Alzheimer's Association, but as such a powerful advocate as well?
So we really do listen to family members in terms of what they need. And we hear this all the time from people who call our 24/7 helpline in terms of trying to be able to navigate and also pay for those services. So what we do at the association is we try to help families plan so they're not doing it in crisis, through education, but also, through good policy efforts, things like advocating for funding for our respite care program here in the state, or the Connecticut Home Care Program for elders, advocating for training for clinical providers so that they can recognize the signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's. And so conversations in those offices can go a lot better. And again, what we did this year around coverage for biomarker testing and really trying to expand access to an accurate diagnosis and, of course, treatment options that are available.
Let's talk about some of that good policy and the way that good policy can be a way of creating support, but also a way of creating awareness. You and the Alzheimer's Association have been very active around House Bill number 6771 here in Connecticut. Share with our listeners a little bit about that bill, what it intends to do, and why it's so important.
So the bill initially was insurance coverage for biomarker testing. Biomarkers are things like blood, saliva, indicators of disease, whether or not it's present, and it can be helpful in the diagnosis or treatment. So the American Cancer Society has been working on this issue for a number of years. And so we partnered with them and 57 other organizations. This was a coalition bill around advocating for insurance coverage, because we were able last year to pass it successfully for those who receive Medicaid services in the state. And what happened was the biomarker bill became the aging omnibus bill. And what that means is that there were several different other bills that were rolled in to one bill. So when it actually reached the floor of the House, there's a number of different really good components that passed. And along the way, there were committee hearings. Families testified about this bill. We went up and met with legislators about the biomarker bill. But some of the other components in the bill were also really beneficial to older adults and their families.
As we see this graying of American society, of people living longer and dealing with different kinds of medical challenges, one of the things that stands out as a concern is health insurance, the benefits and the coverage. Now that people need that coverage longer for more complex medical needs, many people are very afraid that we're seeing changes to Medicaid. We're seeing even changes in the private insurance and healthcare space. The burnout that we're witnessing amongst healthcare providers often matches some of the burnout that we see with caregivers. Talk to me, Christy, about how the work you're doing around Alzheimer's, how does it fit into that, of this fear about, we know that we need this and we're seeing these potential changes, and the fear people have that I've finally gotten a plan in place that will help my loved one. Will I be able to continue? How does this bill or the work that you're doing speak to that?
It actually is very relevant because it speaks to where we're going in terms of our policy and how important state policy has become. So the work is now shifting to access to treatment. And we really are working in the space now about state employee health plans or insurance coverage. So that's going to be the critical sort of next piece. And we ran into, a lot of rhetoric at the beginning of the session, like, it's an insurance bill. Those bills never move, that sort of thing. But when you talk to legislators and you empower families to share stories, legislators, not only with their own constituents, but with their own families, have had challenges around our healthcare system. So in order to improve it, you have to make incremental steps to make it better and to improve that access. And people, I think, fundamentally really understand that.
You've talked about this sort of incremental fits and starts approach to this, but a continuing belief that change is possible because you've seen it and you see what could be possible. You described advocacy on behalf of the Alzheimer's community as the quote unquote long game. Talk to us about the long game.
So I think you have to have a vision and really, for me and for the Alzheimer's Association, sort of looking at Connecticut in terms of what are we doing in terms of our infrastructure in supporting families who are dealing with this disease. So you can't change it all in one session or even a couple of sessions, but it is looking at what is the most critical emerging need, identifying that, and then being really laser focused in your priorities and then mobilizing advocates around that. So each year we work with legislative leaders and sort of identifying, what is something that we can actually incrementally begin to look at changing this year, recognizing that the goal is always to potentially pass a piece of legislation, but that doesn't always happen. There were, I think, 4,000 bills that were introduced this past legislative session, and a very small handful of those get across the finish line. That's just the statistic. So I recognize that we had an incredibly successful legislative year. And then sometimes there are years where we still have success, but we actually might not have the bill pass, if that makes sense.
My final question to you is, yes, this is a long game. It is a very complicated disease. It's a challenging disease, layering on a political process, legislative process that can have its own challenges. And in the middle of all of that, I sense a degree of hope in this work that you do, in the possibility, in the people that you're affecting, and the ability to have a voice in this. When you look at your work, what is it that stands out to you as the thing that keeps you going, even when it's difficult?
What keeps me going is the ability to connect with family members or those that are newly diagnosed and meet with them and bring them to Hartford, and watching and coaching someone to testify on a piece of legislation or having them engage with legislators in our advocacy day and having them come away saying, wow, that was really impactful. They really listened to me. People just want to be heard. And so I think the best and most hopeful thing that I take away is that I believe that we are being heard, and I see that we're going to continue to be heard going forward in the future. So I just know that more people are affected and that more people want to get involved. And I sort of see myself as that bridge to empower people to really want to make change with us, with the Alzheimer's Association.
We appreciate all the work that you're doing to be a bridge, to ensure not just that people are heard, but that they are respected and understood. And I think if we could have more of that in our society, people would feel more connected in their ability to spark that kind of change. Christy Colville is Director of Public Policy for the Alzheimer's Association Connecticut chapter. Thank you, Christy.
Thank you for having me on.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Erica McIntosh, with help from our interns Coco Cooley and Isaac Moss. Special thanks to Sujata Srinivasan. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.